Welcome to episode 200 of Life and Lessons. My name is Adam Horton, and for today only, I'm your host because we're switching things up to celebrate episode 200. And today I'm going to be asking Sean the questions. We'll be covering everything from his journey as a podcaster, public speaking, productivity, The Apprentice, his upcoming book, reflections on his journey in business and his plans for the future, and much, much more. Sean, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here. I'm nervous. I don't know why. This is the first time in 200 episodes that I've been sat on this side. And despite the fact that I can sit in a dark room and talk to myself, the second that there's a real human in front of me, scary.
Yeah. I was going to say, I bet it feels weird. But you're usually the one asking the questions. But yeah, I'm excited to get into it. So let's get into the questions. I've been listening to the pod since it began, haven't missed an episode. It's good learning about someone's life, plans and reflections, but it's been a bit inconsistent this year. Not a complaint, but it isn't like you. So I guess my question is, do you have plans to improve the regularity in 2025?
I think the short answer is I do, and the long answer is actually, I think, quite insightful because, and you always talk about this, like when you introduced me at the Hortons event or a few weeks ago when we were here with some of your team members, the idea that like my big thing in life is consistency. And I like to think that more than most people I know, I can do something for years and years and years without seeing the reward. And generally that's a good path to be on, right? Because this thing I always come back to, that the time will pass anyway, I may as well be doing something with that time that's passing rather than nothing. And yet maybe, I don't know, 2 years ago now, I got to a point with the podcast. I remember exactly where I was. I was in the Voco Hotel in Cardiff, sat downstairs in their restaurant because I needed to just like get away somewhere and rethink the content. Not because anything was going particularly bad, but because I was like, what's the point? Like, what am I doing any of this for? And there was no single thing. It wasn't like, what am I doing any of this for? Because the listenership hasn't grown, because I can't get the guests I want, because I haven't monetized it. It was more just like, is this the right thing to be doing with my life, right? It's a weird, not to sound like a victim, but it's a weird, lonely path, as I'm sure you know, creating content or indeed building anything, because you put hours and hours and hours into it. And I'm appreciative of the people who do turn up, but with the best intention in the world, you still find yourself in the analytics tools at 2 a.m. being like, God, has it really grown? So I found myself in that position a couple of years ago where I couldn't quite work out whether or not the podcast was the thing I wanted to be doing, whether it was going in the right direction, whether I should set these big goals for it or just try and kind of close my eyes for years and see what happened. And I think from that point onwards, I was a little bit lost, in so much as what started as a very simple concept. I sit down once a week, aided by lockdown, because it was very easy to be consistent in lockdown. I think I started the podcast maybe 4 or 5 weeks before we all heard of this thing called coronavirus, which means that episode 7 onwards is like I'm sat at home with nothing to do. Got to this point where I was like, I don't know what this content is for. I don't know where it's headed. And as such, I kind of lost that intrinsic motivation to be doing it. Because, to go back to the point that I half started just now, it started as something very simple. The idea was sit down, talk, right? And then I muddied it and I complicated it by thinking that actually, it needs to be like a means to an end. And I need to decide what that end is. And I need to work out what this is all for. And that kind of needless complication probably continued for the best part of 2 years, right? It was only maybe September of 2024. I think this comes out on the first day of 2025. So September of last year, that I stripped everything back. I disappeared for a while. I stopped producing as much content. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to go back to the kind of output related goals. 52 episodes in a year is my goal next year. A bunch of Instagram content on repeat, newsletters, like forgetting about where this is or isn't heading and returning back to doing it for the sake of doing it. Because in those years when I wasn't overthinking it, when I was doing it for the sake of doing it, was when the majority of all of the results, the majority of all of the upside, the excitement, the momentum, the big guests that I didn't feel qualified to have, that all came along for the ride when I was just doing it. And it was only when I was like, I need to sit down and brainstorm what this is for, that it all fell apart, because I was kind of over-intellectualizing this thing that didn't need to be. So this is a very long way of saying that I hope, and it is in my New Year's resolutions and in my goals and in my habits, that this podcast will be very consistent next year, because I think finally, and this 200 episode is a nice milestone to begin this, I think finally I'm at a point where I can just do it for the sake of doing it again. And if it heads somewhere, amazing. If it doesn't, I've documented my 20s, and that's a win.
When you're setting a very clear goal, like doing 52 episodes in the year, how do you overcome the idea of knowing you the way that I do, you'll want everything that you produce and put out there to be of such a high quality. How do you battle the balance between getting something out there for sticking to the plan, sticking to the 52 episodes versus the quality of the content that you want to do? Are there days where you're putting something out and not that I have this opinion, but that you put out and you think, oh, okay, this is a bit, I don't know, half-hearted, or it has been forced? How do you manage that relationship?
It's an interesting question, because I think the first reflection is that the people who have really been around since day one, like the person who asked that question, are really forgiving, in so much as like it's no illusion that you could probably pick like, I don't know, episode 74. And I have no idea what I'm talking about on that episode, but like as an example, I probably can't be asked. Probably not a lot's happened that week. It's a little bit, but that's kind of the beauty of the podcast, that it's okay to be messy. I think where I've perhaps overstepped in the past and that I've tried to rein back in is I used to want to produce like a YouTube short and a reel every single day. And the momentum of trying to do that, as you suggest, kind of blinded me to the point where I now look back on some of that content. I was literally 10 seconds before we started recording, I was saying that this time last year I was looking back on the content I was recording then, and not that my appearance plays a huge role in the content. I'm sure if I looked better it would be better performing, but I look at it and I'm like, why was I on camera looking that rough and half asleep and my hair isn't done and like the lighting shit and da-da-da-da-da. And it's because I was focusing too much on like, right, I need to produce this stuff. And I think beyond it just not serving a purpose, pushing content out for the sake of it, it probably damaged things, in so much if you're seeing this like guy with long greasy hair who looks like he hasn't had a shower in 4 days, like shouting life advice down a lens at you on Instagram enough times in a row, you're going to be like, I'm just not that interested in that. Does that make sense? So I think trying to strip it back of like, what are the fundamental pillars of the content? To me, it's a YouTube video every Sunday where I think I managed it for like 9 weeks now, but again, the goal is every week next year, where I have like a really considered thought and I get to go into the nuance of it. And it's this podcast where I can just think out loud or chat to somebody like you. And it's the email newsletter because the group of people on there are really supportive and I appreciate their feedback every time I share a thought. And then as like this afterthought, it's maybe some Instagram stuff. Every other platform in my mind doesn't matter next year. Twitter or X, don't care. TikTok, don't care. YouTube Shorts, if the content's there, I'll publish, but don't care. So it's almost trying to hold myself to a lower standard in a weird way to answer your question directly, in so much as I was prioritizing output over quality, and it's a tricky one, right? There is no right answer. There's no right answer.
So the next listener question, what can you tell us about the book?
What can I tell you about the book? Other than the fact that it is very much not complete 3 years in. The book, funnily enough, came about, or the idea of the book was cemented in my mind when I was having a conversation with Peter Watson on his podcast, maybe like 3 years ago. I forget when it was. And I'd had this idea for a book and I'm like, this would be a banger and nobody's written something like this, because, not to get too much into the weeds of what it's about, people tend to author books in their like 40s and their 50s and their 60s, unless you're like a prolific author like, I don't know, Ryan Holiday, who just has a gift for it and he started quite early on. The books in the genre that I am attempting to tackle are authored by people who are, with the most respect in the world, like just so far beyond the expiry date of being able to have relevance with our generation, or let's pluralize that, right? Millennials and Gen Z, because they're kind of interchangeable at this point in many ways. So I had this idea on this podcast with Peter, and it's funny where the book actually came about from, because I've never told this story before. And then it was like 6 months later, and I was going through this, like, so many of these stories, by the way, are going to start with the words, I was going through a weird situationship, and they never materialize into anything. But there was just this weird situation in 2022 with a girl, and it kind of ended, and I was feeling a bit sad and sorry for myself. And so what does like the productivity bro in me do? I'm like, I'm going to get my second MacBook that hasn't been on in 2 years, and I'm going to uninstall all the software and just have Google Chrome, and I'm going to open Google Docs and start writing it. And in the very short term, it was kind of a cope. I was like, I just need somebody to take my mind off of it. Got a couple of chapters in following the broad framework that I had in my mind. And I was like, this is really fucking good. Like, I would read this, and I've read a lot of useless personal development self-help books that seem to be just filling words in order to meet a quota, to print a book, to get a publishing deal, So I got a few chapters in, and then I forgot about it, probably because another girl came in, right? And then it kind of repeated a few times where there'd be these kind of waves of, I'm really motivated to work on the book, now I can't be bothered because things are busy, over and over and over again. And then this time last year, I went on the mission of attempting to get a publishing deal. Incredibly difficult. I don't just say that because I haven't managed to get one. Like, if you look at the numbers, it is phenomenally unlikely that a agent will ever pick up my book, let alone a publisher. So it's a two-tiered system, right? You have to first get an agent who is like a freelance person who goes out and speaks to their publishing contacts, and then should you secure an agent, which is probably like a 1 in 4,000 or 5,000 chance I would hazard based on what I've read, based on the number of titles they receive in their inbox every day. They call it a slush pile, which is these unsolicited proposals where they get like 100 emails, 200 emails a day of shit, and they have to try and fish through with their assistants. Should you get an agent, which I have not yet managed to do, you then have that agent reach out to publishers, and the numbers are again kind of a few thousand to one if a publisher is interested in the book. So all of that happened, and as part of that process, I had to create what's called a book proposal, which is the best way I can describe it. Imagine you were going out to investors with a business. You need like this really kind of succinct overview of the business and the audience and the route to market and the competing businesses, and all of that stuff is what's reviewed by an agent. So this time last year, or actually middle of 2024, I went through that process. So had to kind of articulate more clearly and more intentionally, knowing that this would be scrutinized by others, not only what the book was about, but why it needed to belong. And it was from that point onwards that I took it really seriously, because I'm like, actually, not to sound all like self-aggrandizing and important, but like, this book needs to belong. And if somebody beats me to it and they write this phenomenal title that's very similar, maybe I'll revisit my options, right? Because I'm not necessarily saying I need to be the person to write it, but there's an enormous gap for this book. It's the kind of book that would have helped me no end when I was episode number 1, Sean, sitting down. But also lots of the, I almost let it slip there, lots of the chapters in this book are, I would say, timeless and ageless, right? I look at the listeners of this podcast, for example. I would guess that the average age is maybe 35, 40, which skews older than when I like sharing the lessons I wish I knew in my 20s, which is the concept of this podcast. So I can't say a huge amount about the book other than I believe in it perhaps more than anything I've ever done in my 20s. I would like to finish it by this time next year, have a full edited manuscript and a route to market, which will probably be self-published, so that as I round out my 20s and move into my 30s, I have this thing, which is like, fuck it, let's say it, although it's not completely giving away what it is, it's like the learnings from my 20s, to A, hand back to those who are just beginning their 20s, because we're living in uncertain, weird times for young people. I don't need to tell you that. But B, as this kind of, this new map for the uncharted terrain of being in your 20s and 30s, because there just isn't one right now.
Putting together this this book, looking at your 20s, is there any kind of key themes or like main challenges that people in the 20s come across that you can share a little bit more about? Like, is there anything that you're really trying to address or feel like you could really make a difference with?
It's an interesting question, because there are 20 chapters in the book proposal. A couple of them will probably get swapped out for others. But part of the reassurance and part of the doubt I felt, although they're kind of paradoxical when producing this proposal, is that although there are 20, let's broadly define it so I don't give it away too much, there are 20 ideas in the book, right? There are like 2 or 3 meta themes, and that was kind of my worry. I'm like, am I just saying too many words to get across the same things? But it's the stuff I always talk about, right? It is delayed gratification. It is like expanding your time horizons further than anybody you're in competition with is willing to, because frankly, if I look at anybody I idolize, that is the only way you win. It is... Go on, sorry.
Just on that point, I've looking back to my 20s, I feel like that's only become easier for me as I've reached 30, and then you've got a full decade to look back on. But if I mean, hindsight's a great thing, isn't it? But if I could understand what I know now when I was 20, 21, I feel like I would have had much more discipline at sticking to anything that takes time to compound, whether it's you're putting out content, saving, investing, like all of these things that I understood, but perhaps didn't realize. Maybe it's down to how quickly time actually goes. Like, you go through your 20s and 30 seems like a million miles away, doesn't it? And I mean, you're just around the corner from 30, and actually you look back and it's gone in a flash. And we've been doing something with Horton's, like more of like a charitable project, where we want to work with young people to understand the power of compounding and financial literacy, because I know the 20s is an important period to do that, but actually I think the sooner you learn that, even in your teens, it can make such a big impact decades down the line, can't it? So really interesting. Look forward to reading it.
That's kind of why it's so exciting when you see these like 15-year-olds on Instagram making the reels of like, I'm going to build $1 million business and and it's like, no, you're not, but that's okay, because it's almost like a forcing function of them trying to be the next Iman Gadzi when they're 12, although that's not going to work out, we can safely say, is that they're having to learn all of these incredible lessons about the compounding growth and about delayed gratification, about holding themselves to a higher standard at an age which is just outrageously young. And although they'll probably slip back into just being a normal 15-year-old here and there, can you imagine having that foundation at half of our age and then being able to do the next 15 years of their life to get to a point where they're still younger than we are as we sit here today, but with all of that acute knowledge, it's just, I'm jealous.
Could be very powerful, life-changing. So, great stuff. Next question. Would you ever repeat the BBC Apprentice as an adult?
It's funny because even today when I share stuff about The Apprentice every now and then, it's normally like once a year around the time the series went out, I still get one or two DMs of people being like, what, you were on The Apprentice? Oh my God, that's crazy. And despite the fact that it's in my Tinder bio is something like Lord Sugar fired me on national TV and Scotty T called me a little boy, so I live rent-free in the head of washed up 2000s reality TV stars. Although I still use it there. It's not something I speak about often because A, it was so long ago, right? I have almost lived another entire life of years leading up to that point and years after, right? I was 16 when I went on it, not that far from 32. It was a long time ago. But secondly, and I'm sure there's still a contract living in the drawer of a law firm somewhere in London, which dictates that I can't shit on the process. And the process is good, right? Because you enter into it knowing what it is. You enter into it knowing that it is a television show broadly based around like factual entertainment of business. They don't profess at any point that you're going into this like deeply serious business challenge, right? It's TV. Would I go back on it? I think having seen the inner workings of the show, and I don't say this as a criticism to anyone who works on it because they were all incredible and very accommodating, up to and including Lord Sugar, like probably because we were children at the time, like he was just this, almost this like older uncle figure, right? He was very protective of us in the filming environment. I remember, for example, one of the runners on the show, so every now and then to cool the studio down, they turn off all of the lights above you because there's like no roof in the boardroom. It's not real, right? They turn off all the lights to allow it to cool down. They switch the tapes out in the cameras, and then the runner will come along and refill all the waters on the desk and like reset everything, right? And then you go again. And she dropped the water all over the desk, and then she was like, oh fuck. And because she swore in front of the kids, Lord Sugar like had a go at her as if it was like an Apprentice candidate. But I think again, he's just being protective, right? Like if it was his grandchildren who are these bunch of like 16 and 17-year-old kids, and some person who did their job slightly wrong then doubled down by like swearing in front of a bunch of kids, like it just shows that I think genuinely everyone on the process cared, certainly about the young apprentice lot. And I imagine it's very similar with the older lot. However, it does lose some of its magic when you've watched The Apprentice since the very first episode of the very first series where Tim Campbell won, right the way through until my series in 2012, which was maybe 8 or 9 years. I don't know when it started, but like I watched it all and I loved it. But I can't watch it now because I know it's like how the sausage is made, right? You know that the boardroom isn't in Canary Wharf with that big establishing shot. You know that when you're in a rush, you're not really in a rush because there is this, there's like, this is such a long answer, but it's interesting. There is this like game master. I don't know what the official term is. Somebody who sits off-site, probably part of the executive producer team or somebody very, very senior on the series, who, if something unexpected happens with one of the parts of one of the teams, because you have like the two cars, right, and the two teams, so there's like 4 sets of people off somewhere in London doing something, the producer with you will phone up this like game master and be like, we're stuck in traffic, which means that we're not going to make the rushed appointment that we need to get to in 20 minutes. So like, can all of the teams stand down temporarily so that when we're in a position to resume, everyone can resume and the rush goes on. But you know, it's not really a rush once you've seen that, because it's like I was, oh, this is funny. I've never told this story. I think the phrase is hot mic, isn't it? Like what happened to Gordon Brown when he called that woman a bigoted woman. I had something very similar, but with a apprentice producer, and I was this long-haired, big-suited, fucking squeaky-voiced 16-year-old, so she probably just thought, who is this prick? But all
just
of the
for
time.
context, if anyone wants to see what Sean actually looked like, then just Google it.
Yes, yes, good. I look slightly different, hopefully. She was stood outside the car. We were in the Chryslers at that point. It was before they turned into the new vans, whatever they use, right? The iconic Chryslers. And we're sat in the car, waiting and waiting and waiting. And this is on the first task, because I only made it to 2 tasks. This is on the first task. And I couldn't work out why we were waiting. I'm like, Lord Sugar has just told us that there's this big deadline and there's this rush or whatever. And Karen has said this, like, why are we sitting here? So I'm sat there just moaning about this bloody producer who I've never met before, right? It's like day 1 of filming. I didn't realize that the Apple earphone that they have in is your like mic pack is being transmitted to a receiver, so that when you're not filming, they can hear every word you're saying to make sure that you're not progressing the storyline. And what I mean by that is there are rules. For example, when you go back to the house on The Apprentice, you can't say a word about anything that's so far happened, anything that you're worried about for the boardroom, whether you think you've won or not. Like the second those cameras stop and you go back into the house, or the second the cameras stop for lunch or to change disc in the cameras, I don't know if they use discs anymore, but you get the point, right? It was a long time ago. You do not say a word, because it is crucial for the kind of the storyline that's shown on TV, that anything that's said or done is captured. So I didn't realize this. I didn't realize that she was listening into everything we say. She yanks the door open. Yanks is probably me misremembering it. I'm sure she gently opened the door and she just went at me of being like, da da da, this is how the process works, blah, blah, blah. So like when you've seen things like that, I think it's hard to appreciate it from a viewer's perspective. But to answer the question more directly, I think that's why I would struggle to go on it as an adult, because although it would be like the Adam Collard Love Island return of The Apprentice, where I'd turn up again and everyone would be like, whoa, like, I don't want to say I'm better than that. That's not the right phrase, but it's, if you're optimizing for performing well on a reality TV show, which has this like distant kind of echo of business within it, but ultimately is a reality TV show, that is a very different skill set, as I learned, I think, as somebody who's optimizing to be like an operator in a real business. And what I mean by that is, by time I went on Young Apprentice, surrounded by the other 11 people who are all incredible people to this day. I stay in touch with probably 10 of the 12, and they're all doing incredible things, whether they're doctors or Andrew Tyndall, who's like big in the ad world now, which is amazing to see. Like, they're all doing incredible things. But I think it's fair to say that some people in the series had a personality type which lent itself more to creating good reality TV storylines, and other people had a skill set like mine, where I had run a business for 2 years, right, and made, when I was like 14 and 15, thousands and thousands of pounds of profit through that business, and then was launching Magnate, and by the time I went on to film, had already secured the interview of Richard Branson and like pop chips on the back cover of Magnate and da-da-da-da. Like, that's nuts to me when I look back now that I was a child, but clearly that skill set is not the one which lends itself to doing well on The Apprentice. And so would I go back on? No, because I would probably end up in the exact same position. I'd probably get fired very early on, because I'd be too conscious of 3.5 million people are going to watch this. I need to not like shout my head off and look nuts, but also because my current skill set probably isn't that which would lend itself to winning a reality TV show, but hopefully one day it will lend itself to winning in real business.
I guess it comes down to the fact that actually your skill set is an operator, an entrepreneur, a leader, rather than an entertainer. That's basically what it boils down to, isn't it? Yeah, I just want to go back to your comments about Alan Sugar, because obviously you see these people that, I mean, you can work alongside with high performers all the time, but it's not very often you come across people with such a big media profile as well. Him picking up on someone swearing, to me, that is kind of like having his attention to detail or high standards for the environment. It may be wanting to be protective over a bunch of kids, basically, but also for the fact that is registering with him, I think is a sense that actually is an indication of why he's potentially as successful as he is. Did you see any other traits when you were a part of the program that displayed a real attention to detail or high standards that kind of explained how he's become who he's become?
That's a really interesting question, because the answer that was triggering in my mind as you were speaking is something I've never considered before. And look, we need to caveat this with, he probably has his own wardrobe person, he probably has his own stylist. So like the candidates, you go into this big room, you have your hair done and whatever, like makeup so that you're not shiny on the lights. So he probably has his own person. Same with Karen, same with Nick at the time, because they trust their stylist. But he was so immaculately put together by the time he stepped into the boardroom. And what I mean by that is, just before we did the boardroom scene for the final, you will go back for the final, as you know, he came to say hello to us all. And he looked a bit messy. He just looked like a normal bloke, right? He looked a bit messy. Like, he had half a shirt on, but the collar was undone. It was a little bit up like this. And he had, like, blood on his shirt. He must have just had a shave or something. And he came to say hello, and he just looked like fucking Steve from down the pub, right? And then he walks off this way, like, I don't know where he was going, probably to some dressing room. And then the next time we see him is when he's round the back of the set to come in through the doors that he comes in from. And he is, like, wearing the cleanest, most perfect suit. And I know there's part in his autobiography that I read before the process, so, like, getting on for 20 years ago, where he talks about the idea that somebody in his family, I forget who, was a tailor, so, like, he'll always pull his trousers up before he sits down so it's not stretching the fabric. Like, he just looked immaculate. Like, his watch was in this, like, very, how can a watch be in a nice position? But you know what I mean? It was perfectly straight on his wrist. It just sat so well. It was fitted so well. His hair was so well put together. And that's probably no accident. And what I mean by that is, this is why it's such an interesting question, because I've never picked up on it, but it's probably no accident that somebody who pays attention to so many details around him and is always cognizant of what's happening with him and with others is probably the same kind of person who would build an enormous business and then property empire like he has.
Is there anyone else that you've met or interviewed that has displayed those same sort of real attention to detail that is rare?
Do you know who else was fascinating for completely opposite reasons? And it just happens that he was also an interviewee of Magnate, so this is a long time ago. Jamie Lang, in the very early days of Candy Kittens, which I didn't consider any of this remarkable then because he was older than me, right? I was like 17, maybe 18. Jamie was on the front cover of issue 2 of Magnate, and like, he was really old at the time in my mind because he wasn't 17 or 18, right? He was this guy from Made in Chelsea who turned up really nicely dressed in his Room 10 tailored suit and da-da-da. But when I look back now, I realize that he must have been, like, I'm guessing, but like 23 or 24 back then.
Yeah.
And yeah, exactly, like a kid, right? If I look at somebody who's 23 now, I'm like, they're still a kid because I still was back then. I just didn't realize it when I was 17 and interviewing him. But to look at the way that there's this idea that always stuck with me as he was juggling a million plates, right? Because he was mid-interview and then he couldn't get over to Northern Ireland that night to do some club PA thing because he had other stuff going on, and it was like London Fashion Week that week. So then he, in the most bizarre turn of events, because I was a big Made in Chelsea fan back then, he phoned Francis Boulet and he's like, mate, Boulet, if I give you another grand, don't quote me on this, but it was roughly this. He's like, if I give you another grand on top of the fee, will you go out there and sort that for me and do the PA for me today? He's like, yeah, man. So like, he's juggling all of these plates whilst doing this interview, whilst having just come from a fashion show, whilst doing the TV stuff. And yet with all of that noise, like, he was so laser focused on, he said this thing that stuck me about, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but how something he has so far learned about business is that business and getting money from consumers and other people is just a riddle, right? People have money that they are going to give to you. You just need to work out the answer to the riddle that, once solved, will allow them to give it to you. And then that's only a remarkable thing for him to say, and that's only a remarkable kind of clarity when you look at what Candy Kittens between him and Ed has become in the 10 years since, because it's enormous, right? You can't go into any shop without seeing every one of their ranges, and they're everywhere, and they're this like real big serious brand. And it's so easy to dismiss it and be like, well, he's just some face off reality TV, and like, he was handed this and McVitie's this and trust fund that and blah, blah, blah. But if you look into it, like, lots of that isn't true. Like, he speaks at length on certain podcasts about the fact that, like, the McVitie's fortune, like, that's not coming to him. That's just some like tabloid idea that people use to dismiss his achievements. But also, like, you and I know what it takes to build something even 100th of the size of Candy Kittens. So imagine the stress and the pain and the working out financing or suppliers or this issue and da-da-da. He didn't need to do any of that. Like, he was set for life, right? He could have gone on I'm a Celebrity or become a radio host, Capital FM, whatever it might be, and just been okay. But the fact that when he was so young, he had this clarity to be like, we're going to build this thing with this candy business because there is this riddle and we just need to solve it. And once we solve it, everyone's going to give us our money. And it comes true. And is still going a decade later. Like, when I think back on that, that's a really remarkable moment.
Nice. The next question was, what do you like most about public speaking?
What I like most about public speaking is perhaps a weird answer, in so much as the whole fear that people have about public speaking is that you're speaking in front of 50, 100, 200. This thing I'm doing in Paris in February is up to 1,000 people, right? People are like, oh my God, there's so many people, that's crazy. What I like is the fact that you're never speaking to let's say 200 people, right? You're speaking to like 2 or 3 people who you can see are most switched on, who you can see the cogs are turning, and who, I mean, let me break it down what I speak about when I go into schools, for example, because that seems to be where most of my talks are. Like, I'm not talking, rightly or wrongly, to the 95% of people in that room who are, because this is the right path for them, I'm not criticizing them, they're going to get their A-levels, then they're going to go to uni, they're going to have a nice job, and they probably come from a family who is financially well off enough to support them through that process, and it's all okay, and they're going to live a great life, and that's amazing, right? I'm not talking to them, A, because they probably don't care what I have to say, because it's so far from the world that they are currently living in, the one they're going to go on to live in, but also B, because that's not the place that I come from, and that's not my experience, right? And that's the same, I'm sure, when you go into a room and speak about property or whatever it is, or like entrepreneurship in the estate agency space. Like, most of the people in a room like that are going to be people who are, I don't know, working a job, or they own a traditional estate agency or whatever. But there's going to be a couple of people in that room who are looking at you like, I want what this guy has. Like, what he's done with Horton's is incredible. I'd love to become a partner or rip off the business model or whatever it might be, right? And I see it very similar when I'm speaking in a room of people, that there are a couple of people in there who maybe they can relate to my backstory more than the guy who was in last week with the shiny suit talking about business. Maybe they can relate more than their careers officer. Maybe they see a side to the world that isn't reflected in their current experience, whether that's because of this kind of socioeconomic background they come from, or their parents' jobs, or their school and their teachers telling them entrepreneurship isn't real. Like, don't be silly, go get a job. And fortunately, it seems at least like we've kind of turned the page on that as a society. Actually, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, because I was reflecting on this the other day. I've just got back from sitting in a room on my own for 2 days in Birmingham to try and just like decompress for the year. And this thought I was having is that when I was in school, so what? God, I'm old. Like, let's call it 15 years ago. Like, entrepreneurship was weird. Like, what? You wanna not have a job and go and essentially be unemployed and work for years for like way less than you'd otherwise earn, with no guaranteed upside and no pension and no like security, to then maybe one day make enough money to like try and claw back those years. Like, don't do that. Go get a job. It was weird. Now, rightly or wrongly, it's quite glamorized, right? We have the big entrepreneurs and the Iman Gadzis and the, I don't know, James Smith and Chris Williamson with Newtonic, right? People look at business owners like that and they're like, that's really cool. So maybe the page has turned slightly, in the sense that entrepreneurship is good. But when I speak to a room full of kids and teenagers, I like the fact that a couple of people are listening. When I speak to a room full of adults, with like the talk I did when you were there in Loughborough, for example, like, I'm broadly just speaking about life lessons that apply to me. And just because of how the cookie crumbles, the majority of people in there, although they're nodding along and they're like, oh, this is quite interesting, they're quite passive in the process, as they should be, because not every story and not every kind of idea is going to resonate with everyone. But there are a couple of people in every room who are like, I get it. This guy gets me. I get this guy. Like, this is the idea I needed to push through this or change that. And that's what I enjoy most. And actually, just one last thought on this, because it's quite meta. Because, of course, we were here a few days ago doing one of those year planning sessions I've been running. And between the Hortons guys who did it, yourself included, and the few sessions I've hosted one-on-one as video calls, it's so cool to deliver these ideas that it feels like you're sometimes speaking into an abyss, right? Like you're talking to an empty room, metaphorically, with things like a podcast. Somebody books a session, you send them the documents, and then you jump on a call with them, and they're like, as a result of this document and your ideas and your thoughts, and by the way, I take no credit for this, because they're the ones who are going to go and do the hard work for the next year now. Like, I've bought this thing, or I've done that thing, or I've changed this, or I sleep with my phone outside my room, or I'm going to save this much money, and I've set up a direct debit to a charity so I can tick off my giving thing. Like, it's amazing that through these little interactions with the tiny handful of people for which it resonates, like, they change their lives, their feedback changes my life, and it's this like positive feedback loop. Everybody wins.
It sounds like the idea of just being mindful of the fact that you can't please everyone. Like, were you talking to a room full of people? Everyone's on a spectrum, in the sense of there'll be some people who are completely uninterested, and the people that are nodding along and engaged and will come and ask you questions at the end. But I think a lot of people's fears with public speaking is the fact that they've got to go out on stage and they've got to please everyone who's looking at them. And what you've described there, I think, is a really practical way of being able to, when she's standing in front of an audience, just decide, okay, I've got to work out who my audience is and deliver for them and forget everyone else, sort of thing. And then the people that are in the middle of the spectrum that might be interested, that you could win over, like, if you do, then great. If you don't, they're just part of the audience that you were never going to captivate at the start. I think that's that's quite a practical exercise that people could use if they're going to speak, to think through that before they take a step out on stage, I guess.
A nice exercise to double down on that is, let's actually run through this, right? You probably went to at least one event 7 years ago, whenever 7 years ago was, right? Do you remember the speakers who you were indifferent towards? Do you remember quite disliking the kind of cadence of speech that somebody gave, or the way they were dressed, or like their slides were a bit ugly? Of course you don't. It doesn't even exist in your head anymore. So these situations, if you approach them in the way we just spoke about, are a no-lose situation, in so much as the people who you either are definitely trying to win over or you have the ability to win over are going to resonate with what you say, and it will be that net positive where everybody wins. The people who hate you or don't care, they're not going to remember you anyway, because none of us do. So who cares, right? If you went into every situation realizing that the people who have the greatest disdain for you will forget about you far sooner than you forget about them, right? And will stop thinking about that weird quirk in your speech far sooner than you stop thinking about them thinking about your weird quirk in your speech. Like, you would be so much more confident and happy, because the people who don't care don't care.
I think it also goes the other way, not just with the audience, but once you do enough public speaking, you also forget about the ones that went really badly. Like, whilst you're talking there, if I really wrap my brains, I can think of occasions that were just horrendous from my own experience. But the next time you get up stage and you realise that it wasn't fatal, the last experience, and you overcome it and you get a little bit better each time, you soon diminish the importance of those early experiences. Whereas a bit like learning a musical instrument, in the sense of, like, you don't remember the time when you sat down at a piano for the first time and couldn't play a thing, but that was the reality at some point, and half of it's just having the confidence to suck at something for long enough, isn't it? But what you think is going to be defining as a speaker years later down the line, it just is completely irrelevant.
I think we can turn that into a meta lesson as well, because I was doom scrolling this morning, and I kind of hoped that this TikTok that I randomly saw would be relevant, because it felt nice at the time. I forget the exact thing. I think the guy's name's Scott, and he is a artist who paints stuff, and he was asked by MTV at this year's VMAs to paint a picture of Busta Rhymes, and he painted this picture, and then he happened to bump into Busta Rhymes backstage, and Busta Rhymes saw the painting and loved it, and and he thought that was the end of the interaction. But then Busta Rhymes was either presenting an award or won an award. I have no idea. I didn't watch the VMAs. So he was out on stage in front of the world, right? And rather than doing the speech that he was planning to do, Busta Rhymes was like, I just met this guy backstage called Scott, and he's taught me this really magical thing about the process of learning anything like art or public speaking, because he has this program where he sits down with these underprivileged kids, and he doesn't show them the incredible pictures of Busta Rhymes to teach them. He shows them like the shit that he made 20 years ago that's awful. And that's the entry point where he's like, look how terrible I was, right? I'm in this position where I'm painting Busta Rhymes and being spoken about on international TV, right? That's not where I started. I started with this terrible thing here. And to your point, understanding that is a unifying feature of everybody who's ever done anything worthwhile, period, is really nice, because it means that those first difficult, kind of uneventful, awkward, weird steps are the most magical, because you know that you're treading in the footsteps of everybody who you admire, but also taking more and more steps away from that kind of stagnant version of yourself who isn't going to fulfill your potential if you don't first take those steps.
So the next question is, what are some of the most memorable moments from your podcasting journey so far? And what's the funniest or maybe the most chaotic thing that's happened whilst recording? Things that we might not know about.
There's definitely an answer for the second part, and I'm not going to name the person, but I'll tell the story because it's nuts. The first part, I think, this sounds unrelated, but bear with me here, right? I did a TED Talk like 10 years ago, and I was terrified at the time. A TEDx talk, not a real TED Talk, like 10 years ago, terrified at the time. Rehearsed and practiced for months and months and months. You get given like a mentor when you do a TED Talk who's like a speaking coach, and they guide you through how to like build a story arc and how the first words are really important to captivate the audience. And there's no script, there's no cue cards. Like, you're in front of 100 people watching or 1 million people on the TED channel if it goes well, right? So like, there's pressure, and it's TED. You're like, oh my God, I'm doing a TED Talk. Terrifying. Got to the end of it. It went okay. My hair like fell over my eyebrows, so I look really weird in the video, but the talk itself went okay. And the second I finished, I'm walking off of this TEDx stage, and before I'd even got to the curtain, I said to myself in my head, and this seems really profound given that I was 19 at the time, I was like, nobody can ever take that away from me. I've done a TED Talk now. Like, tick, done. Like, the next 30 years of my life could go terribly wrong. That's still something that is an irreversible achievement, right? I think the highlights of the podcast are where I've had the opportunity to sit down and record with like Chris Williamson or Oliver Burkeman or Johan Hari or Rory Sutherland, these people who just, I could listen to talk all day, and I really have learned so much from their thoughts and from their work and from their writing, to be able to sit down and have a conversation with them, but also, if I can get away with saying this, kind of hold my own in the conversation and use that as a kind of waypoint of growth, right? So for example, Chris, although it has been 3 or 4 years now since I recorded with him, which is nuts because at the time it seemed like he was the biggest podcaster ever, and he was tiny then compared to now. But like the fact that I grew up, but like the formative years in my early 20s were almost entirely guided by him and his content. I think I discovered Modern Wisdom when it was on like episode 16 or something, like just by pure fluke. I wasn't looking for it. A video came up on the YouTube algorithm. I watched that one, then I watched his interview with Don McGregor and then a couple of others, and then I tweeted him like, this is insane, like this is so good. The fact that he, through this parasocial relationship, taught me so much, to then be able to sit down and talk to him for an hour and a half about the things that I find most interesting, and it'd be like a thoroughly enjoyable conversation, right? It wasn't like this charity work that he was doing where he was like, cute, this guy's got a podcast. Like, we just had a chat and it was solid for both parties. So much so, and it's still my greatest flex, that he took that episode and put it on Modern Wisdom, which at the time people were like, what's Modern Wisdom? Now it's like the biggest podcast in the UK, minus maybe, or in the space, minus maybe like Diary of a CEO, right? So crazy. When I look back at the people who I've spoken to and realize that they're irreversible achievements, I probably shouldn't still be going on about the Chris Williamson episode in 10 years' time, but it will always be there, right? Or Oliver Burkeman, right? This author who, he wrote 4,000 Weeks in his most recent book, Meditations for Mortals. They're just really nicely written, really useful, practical ideas that have changed my life. To be able to sit with him for an hour and 10 minutes and like have this smiley, laughy, lovely chat. Or Johan Hari, who had to rush off because he had a flight to catch like a minute after the recording. Like, it was the most rushed thing ever. But he was the person I hoped he would be, in so much as like I've read all of his books and his writing is incredible, whether it is on like anxiety and depression with lost connections or stolen focus, our kind of curse of being addicted to social media. Really useful books. I hoped he would be lovely when I spoke to him, and he was lovely. So they're the nice moments where I'm like, oh, I can speak to these people who I admire the work or lives of, and the respect is reciprocated, like they're thoroughly good people, but also I come away thinking like that's irreversible, right? I will always have had that group of people who I admire on the podcast. That's nice. The story that nobody knows is a bit nuts, and I out of respect of the person who it was and the publicist who did her best in challenging situations, there was a interview that I recorded. I won't even say when. I'll be so non-specific that if the person, they're not watching it, but if the person were to watch it, they wouldn't even know it's about them. There was an interview I recorded with a very esteemed, is that the right word? Like a very highly respected, qualified person in a particular area. And they had written a book, and I had done this thing where, let's kind of pull back the curtain of podcasting. I learned this from Chris Williamson, actually. I emailed him a few years ago where I'm like, I've got all of these authors on. How do I read the books? And he's like, you don't. You like read the content section to work out roughly what the book's about. You read the Amazon reviews to see the key takeaways. You maybe watch on 1.5 times speed the previous interviews they've done. And you get this kind of holistic view of, I don't know, if I were to ask you to summarize a book that you really enjoy, you could probably tell me about it without having to read like 350 pages at me. Does that make sense? You get the key themes so you understand what to ask.
Weirdly,
about.
I've had books where I've started to read them and not got into it. And then I've taken that approach and now I understand what the book's about. So I feel like I've read it when I haven't.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
So
but that proves the point, right? Yeah. So I was open with him as I am any author if I haven't had a chance to digest their entire book at the beginning of the podcast before we start recording. It's just common courtesy, right? In so much as I'm like, look, your publicist sent this to me and it turned up 3 days ago and I've got 2 of these podcasts back to back. So I think I have a thorough understanding. If there is anything that I stray into the realm of like, I'm making up what you said or paraphrasing, just correct me. It's fine. We can edit it out. Like, we'll get through it. I'd say 9 times out of 10, but like every time out of every other time it's worked other than this one case. But this is where the story gets nuts, because the real reason I believe that the interviewee was unhappy with the interview was because they made this, how do I word it? They made like an insensitive analogy, which when housed within the context of the conversation made perfect sense. Like I didn't even really pick up on it at the time. Like it made sense, right? But if you were to take it in isolation, if you were like one of this person's peers or contemporaries or professional colleagues, you'd be like, what the fuck's he saying that for? That's nuts, right? So we had this whole conversation. It went on for about an hour and a half. This is the bizarre bit of the story, but this is so unrelated to the wider point. This person had to go and use the toilet, they said, about an hour in, and their toilet must have been right next to their microphone because I could hear like everything, which was just so off-putting because then when they returned, I had to be like, how are you? Crazy. But that's like an aside in the story. We finished the interview. They seem to have enjoyed it as much as they could, like sitting and talking about your work again for an hour and a half with another podcast. Like, it's probably not that exciting. They're just doing promo to sell books, but they seemed relatively pleased. Then, about an hour later, I thought it went quite well, to be clear. About an hour later, I get an email from the individual directly to me, so their publicist isn't copied in, saying, can you just promise me, I'm paraphrasing game, but can you just promise me you'll clip out the bit where I mentioned XYZ thing, because it was poorly judged and da-da-da. And I got it. Like, I didn't reply straight away because I was actually turning up at a friend's house and it was like 8 p.m. at night because they were in another time zone. But I had every intention of replying and being like, yeah, of course. Like, if you don't want that in, I get a why out of context. That would seem crazy. Sure, why not? Don't reply that night. Then the next morning I wake up from the publicist who's like, this author said that Scott, they got my name wrong, it's Sean. They thought that I was like Scott's assistant or something. This author said that Scott didn't read any of the book and they came ill prepared and they didn't want to do this and da-da-da and the conversation made no sense and blah, blah. Like every excuse you could fathom other than, oh, and the author said something they didn't want in and didn't get a response quickly enough, so probably panicked. And look, if most people would do the same, I hope I wouldn't, but most people do the same, right? If your publicist of your publisher who you have a big contract with is like, how did the podcast go? You're probably not going to tell them, oh, I slipped up and said this thing. You're probably going to say, yeah, that Scott guy was shit at his job and like, I don't want this interview to go out. So we had this back and forth where I'm like, look, I'm happy to edit the episode and send it to you and give you a final sign off as to whether or not we use it. And then you can decide, right? Because this is a big publishing company who I was speaking to, and I didn't want them to think that I was ill-prepared because it was a wicked interview. I stand by that. I would still have published it if they allowed me. But then, and you'll know this exact period I'm talking about because I recorded a conversation with you at the exact same time that we didn't publish. And the reason I didn't publish it is I just kind of, to my point about inconsistency earlier, it got to the end of the year and I just like fell off for 2 months, couldn't be bothered, lost motivation, was a bit burned out. So I never edited the episode, nor did I send it to them. So they never approved it, so it never went live. But bizarre, right? Because it was such a good conversation.
I really want to know who you're talking about. But you've obviously kept it under wraps because I remember the story of something like that happening, but I can't remember who it was. So it's a genuine secret.
It is a genuine secret. And their book's good. That's the worst thing. Yeah. Like, really interesting person. Great conversation, really practically useful book. You can probably tell by the number of times I've said the word practically useful. Like that's something I really aim for with these conversations, right? If it's too abstract, don't really care. This person is at the top of their field, did this groundbreaking pioneering research all those years back, turned it into a book to summarize that idea, to make it accessible. And as far as I can tell, unless I could just have this big blind spot, right? Maybe the conversation was terrible and I'm too optimistic. Maybe I offended this person because there was some cultural thing where I've put more years of research into this than you've been alive, so how dare you not read it? It could be that. I think it was just that they said something that out of context would look quite poorly and didn't get a response soon enough for me to reassure them that it won't go live. Panicked because they're like, I don't even know who this guy is and he's got this footage of me saying this thing. And that's where it went. But I mean, look, I have the same amount of respect for that individual that I did beforehand. Similarly, their agent was in a difficult position, so it is what it is.
Do you have any dream podcast guests that are maybe, or anyone that you can tell us about that's coming on next year?
There's actually nobody. There's one person kind of confirmed in February, who I won't name just because I've learned that lesson. I've learned not to name podcast guests until you cash the check. You don't name them for various reasons. There is somebody else who was confirmed last year, you know who I'm talking about, who then things happened and their schedule got in the way, who I've been told by their agents to email again in the new year, because they kind of took a hiatus from podcasts, probably to film big television shows, because you would absolutely know who they are. Like, they're one of the top.
And that would be an amazing podcast.
It would be because he is the most incredible, unexpected self-development thinker I think I've ever heard speak.
Yeah,
it's
curveball
insane.
the first time I heard him.
100%, because I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't think it's a comedian, and when I've heard this person's comedy, which is the word reductive, like it's like one-liners, right? I'm like, they're funny, but like, meh. When I heard this person on a few podcasts, I'm like, this is insane. This is a completely different individual. So they were confirmed because the actual person replied to my email and said yes, but then of course agents get involved, and then there are other curveballs. Are they still confirmed? I have no idea, right? It's been a year. It was like the 5th of January last year. So it's literally been a year. I don't know if they're still confirmed. And then I have a little kind of hit list that I want to go after this year in a slightly different approach, because there's a bunch of people I'd love to record with. And
who are the one or two people that come to mind straight away where you think, if this was possible, or people you really want to have a conversation with?
You know what? On the spot, I can't think of any names. It would be, let me throw random names out there, right? So it would be people like, I can't even think of this guy's name. There's a guy who has the Institute for Boys and Men in the US. Have you heard this guy on Modern Wisdom?
It's not Scott Galloway, is it?
No, but he is actually also on the list. So people like that who talk about issues that face. So, for example, there's this big argument that there should be a minister for boys and men, because there is a minister for women and girls. And I believe the general argument is something along the lines of, we can accept that there are problems unique to men and boys in the same way that there are problems unique to women and girls. And you don't need to apologize to women and girls before acknowledging that, like, the greatest danger to a man under the age of 45 is his own hands, because he is more likely to die through killing himself than anything else. Like, that is a not completely unique male issue, but it is a predominantly male issue, right? The argument of having somebody who is responsible for looking into those issues in government and helping tackle them, whilst not taking away anything from the very serious, real, and kind of daily lived experience issues that women and girls face, but having both. So he has this whole argument chain about that. I'd love to dive into that more, because both of us are men, and our friends and our family experience these issues. People like that, where it's getting a little bit more into the nitty gritty of, I don't want to say like culture and politics, because that's a bit too far for me, but almost just these deeper topics that I perhaps steered clear of. It's those kinds of people.
So it's not necessarily people with a big profile, but more about subjects and people with the specialism of topics you just want to dive into.
And two thoughts here, forgive me, because they're so unrelated. Number one, we spoke a few days ago about one of your plans for the new year. I hope you don't mind me saying publicly, is learning more about stuff that pops onto your radar where you're like, oh, I don't know about that thing, and I probably ought to. I'm going to proactively learn about it. The approach there is like, if something interests me, the issues of boys and men, because we're both men and we face issues, or our peer group does, and they seem to be underrepresented. You can say that without having to apologize to the kind of girls and women. Like, we're not pitting against each other, right?
Being separate.
Exactly. Being able to dive into stuff like that would be super interesting. But then secondly, I had a conversation with Patrick Foster, who wrote a book called Might Bite, and this was like, he was like one of the first 10 guests, and his publisher got in touch, and they were like, we have this guy called Patrick who's written a book about gambling addiction. Do you want to have him on? And I'll be so honest, in the beginning, I'm like, I'm not really sure that's what this podcast is, because I was still trying to work out what the guest episodes were even meant to be, right? Had Patrick on. His story is incredible. He tells it so well. He tells it with such patience. And what I mean by that is, it can't be an easy story for him to tell, right? £4 million worth of other people's money gambled and lost on an addiction that he had to hide whilst losing his job and then almost taking his own life, right? Can't be easy to tell that story, but he tells it with such patience and almost grace for the listener, who has to suddenly go from like being on their daily commute to transport themselves into this world. And he does it so gradually that you kind of can follow him along on the story. That episode has been listened to and played on YouTube more than any other episode. If you combine the totals, it's probably like, I don't know, 65,000 people have watched that, right? Had no idea who he was. I curiously approached this topic that seemed a little bit interesting. That paid off more than trying to chase the big guest. Like, there's another guest who I won't name, equally as amazing person, but I got them on because I'm like, oh, they're a huge name, and I'm gonna get, and it got like freaking 10 views. Like, literally, it's one of the least viewed videos I've ever published. So there's that. But then also from an impact perspective, there's a story of Patrick messaged me one day out of the blue on Twitter. And he's like, hey mate, it was so casual. He was like, hey mate, I just thought you'd want to see this. And it was somebody who had, I forget the exact details, so bear with me here, but roughly this, right? They watched the episode whilst they were like, it was like 2 a.m. and they had a gambling addiction and it had stolen everything from them, as these addictions do. And they were in the kind of preparation stage of imminently taking their own life. And then they found this episode from Patrick and they listened to, I take no credit for this, because although people are like, oh, but you hosted the conversation, but it was all Patrick's doing, right? They found this conversation, they listened to Patrick, they saw in front of them somebody who had been to hell and come back and was like a well-functioning, articulate, interesting, recovering person. And so they decided, having watched that episode, to not take their own life. That's nuts, wow. Right? And that's because curiosity led us to that place in that conversation. So I think that as a kind of guiding principle moving forward, I guess, yes, you're right. It's more, does this person seem interesting? Yes. Will it get 4 views? Possibly, but who cares? Because maybe one of those 4 people really needs that conversation.
Amazing. I think it's the idea of the depth versus the width, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the quality of the conversation and how much impact it can have on someone's life. Like when you put it in such stark terms like that, makes you realise how important it is. But yeah, what a story. What's one piece of advice you would give to episode 1, Sean, personally, and one piece professionally?
Personally, I'm having to actually think about this because it's too easy for me to fall back into one of my comfort topics, like just be consistent, and like, sure, just be consistent. But I think personally, it would probably be something like life is like incredibly messy and in some places dark and terrible, but that when you zoom out far enough, it's all okay. And what I mean by that is, am I right in saying this? I think I had already started the podcast by this point where I'm about to reference. If not, I'd certainly started producing content on the internet, right? Like I started doing IGTV videos and stuff where I was kind of trying to project myself as somebody who knew how to navigate life, as we all are in our own way, whether it's like with our friends and family or publicly. And then like a sequence of things happened with my dad's illness where he went from being ill to like having this episode where things were nuts. Like there's no other word for it, right? Like to the point where he had to, like, the police had to be called and he disappeared somewhere with a fucking knife and then had to be arrested for his own safety and then ended up being sectioned and then was in hospital. And then we're like trying to navigate our daily normal lives whilst having all of this uncertainty of like, will he ever be discharged from this hospital and what happens next, and can he come and live back at home, and and all these things which in retrospect are quite easy to deal with, in the sense that like, you know, their logical conclusions, so you can look back and be like, oh, it all worked out kind of okay in the end, right? Like he is in a care home now where the level of care is incredible and they've looked after him so well, and he seems more content and happy now despite the illness being far more progressed than it was back then. But in the moment when I was that guy sitting down to record episode 1, on a personal level this is, life had been, I don't want to say easy because everyone has their challenges, right? But life had been like fairly uneventful up until that point, to the point where when these big obstacles started hitting, it's too easy to be like, this is existential and all-encompassing and things will never be the same after this, or I'll never be happy after this, or like my life will never recover after this. And it's probably true to say that all the way from like age 4 or 5 when we have our first memories right the way through until the two of us sit down here today, there have been negative things that have either consciously or non-consciously shaped our experiences or our views. Or like, I'm convinced that the reason I'm chronically single is because of like my view of relationships and my parents' kind of connection or lack thereof, at least in front of me as a child, right? But once you realize that you can go through those things, whether they're big or small, and still kind of be okay, right? Like it's been 5 or 6 years since I recorded that first episode, probably 5 years since that being one of like several big things that kind of exploded in life as they do in all of our lives. And yet we're sat here and we're like happily having a little chat and it's sunny outside and everything's okay and like all is fine. Not because everything went back to normal, but because what normal is always changing. And once you embrace that things are forever changing and good and bad happen in equal measure all the time, whether you want them to or not, and trying to find this kind of path down the middle where realizing that things might be terrible today or this week or this month. You might be in a season of life that you fundamentally hate right now. And I don't even mean like clinically depressed. I just mean we all have these periods of life where it's like, oh, this is a lot and I'd rather not be doing this. But once you zoom out far enough, so I guess I am going back to one of my comfort themes in a way, zooming out far enough, you realize that everything will be okay. And I don't mean that in some like woolly sense. I just mean that there will be days where you wake up and it's nice. So like it's all okay in the moment because you know you're headed somewhere fine.
Is that what you would say to episode 1, Sean, if they walked down and sat at the table?
Yeah, I'd probably, you know what, actually, let's go back to the exact night when my dad was in A&E. So this is a mad story to tell, right? A bunch of shit happened where I think he was having some sort of like, for context of somebody, if anybody doesn't know, he has Alzheimer's, but in amongst that was this kind of like, a few years into the Alzheimer's, like he had this psychosis episode, is that the word, where like reality and fiction kind of blurred into this like weird world that for a few weeks he was living in. And because we were like, oh, it's just dementia, like most people haven't been firsthand exposed to a loved one that you live with having dementia, and as such, like you don't know what's right or wrong. You don't know what's like, is this just this or is this actually something else? And so it kind of grew and grew and grew, and then all of this happened, and he ended up in A&E. So the police arrested him, but not to like charge him, just to like fucking get him to safety. And then they dropped him off with my mum at A&E. And we were in A&E for 14 hours because he got forgotten about. Like, they just forgot to help him. And so he was, like, spiraling and spiraling and spiraling. And just before he, like, this is nuts. Just before, at, like, 5 a.m. the next morning, he ran off down the car park to try and fucking escape. Because, of course, he would, because he was living in this world that was very real to him. There was this nurse who was watching him. And it's almost like poetic how this happened, because as she and I were talking, over her shoulder, I saw him walk out the front doors, and that's when he tried to fucking sprint off, and all the security guards are chasing, because she was like, no, I think he just went around the corner. I'm like, no, he definitely went out the doors. Anyway, like a minute before that happened, she looked at him, she's like, oh, you're in for a bumpy ride. And I think that's a really nice way of putting it, although it wasn't nice at the time, in so much as like a bumpy ride still gets you somewhere, and a bumpy ride is still going somewhere. And I mean, shit, like if we could all opt to not have the bumps, we would, but we can't. So what are your options? You either have this kind of ambient anxiety for the whole of your life about the thing that's currently happening, or the next bad thing that's going to happen, or, and I think this is just growing up, right? We all get there at a certain point. You just kind of resign to it. It's why you see old people who are so happy, right? Their wife or husband might be terminally ill, and their pension might be running low, and there's all this stuff going on, but they're just kind of chill because they've seen it all before. And I'm not pretending that I am a wise 70-year-old who can put this into practice every day, because I can't, because like all of us, there are days where I'm like, it's all terrible. But more often than not, trying to ride that bumpy ride for what it is has resulted in a better outcome than trying to kind of navigate the bumps manually and steer the car and whatever other things come from this metaphor, right? So if episode 1, Sean was sat there, both personally and professionally, right? Because you know better than anyone that being in business is messy and difficult and hard and weird. Just ride the bumpy ride, because it's going to be bumpy regardless, but it is a ride. It's taking you somewhere. You're not stagnant. You're not stuck in that place. You're going through that place. There's that, what is it? The quote, is it like misattributed to Churchill, as they all are, about if you're going through hell, keep going? It's just that, isn't it? Just keep going.
Yeah. There's also a really overused story like about not knowing whether something's good or bad at the time. I'm not going to butcher the story about the Chinese farmer's son or whatever.
The donkey in the army. Yeah.
But I'm sure if you're watching this, you've probably heard it. But it's only with hindsight that you can relate things to that situation. But I think it's a really good point, and just being prepared to embrace the journey rather than, yes, you don't want bad things to happen. Yes, it's particularly difficult if it's friends, family, health related. But ultimately, like, embracing it and looking for the positives is sometimes the only way you can deal with it, isn't it? If you without that, it becomes a negative spiral, doesn't it?
There's a phone background. I skip through a few of them with different little mantras in, because I need to remind myself of the same lessons every day, it seems. That Alex Hormozy quote of "This is what hard feels like," and it applies both in business but also in personal life, that like hard things are hard, right? That's like the stereotype. And there's that video where the guys are watching the Stephen Bartlett podcast and they're mocking him because he's like, I've discovered that hard things are hard. And although it sounds very like simplistic, actually just embracing that idea of like things are hard, but that means that most people won't get through them, and B, there's something worthwhile on the other side of it. Embracing hard, whether it is selective hardness, i.e. something you've chosen to do, or kind of forced upon you, is the only way I found to deal with it.
I think as well, especially in a professional format, if you're doing things outside the normal path, you're also asking it to be difficult as well. Like if you're running a business and you've got payroll to meet and the VAT bill's coming up and then the NI bill lands and then this happens and someone leaves after you've trained them, and like you could go on and on and on and on. If you're in entrepreneurship, like you've asked for all of those hard things. And sometimes when I'm like, I don't know, the ups and downs of the journey, I find it quite helpful just to sit back and go, like, you made this happen. You either take accountability for the problems or you accept them of the fact that you were the one who decided to go down a different route and take the risk, because that's what the risks are. They're there. So we're going to move on and finish with some questions that you weren't expecting. So I've had some questions sent to me, so I'm going to hit play.
Hi Sean, it's Chloe. Congratulations on your 200th episode. My question for you is, which guest surprised you the most and why? See you soon.
That's a good question. Surprised me. Let me think about that. This pause isn't to say it's a bad question, to be clear. I just need to genuinely think about it. Who surprised me? I think somebody who surprised me is somebody that we both know, Billy Harris, because he was the first guest I ever had on the podcast, and he and I had spoken fleetingly in the past where I kind of considered becoming a client of his and then didn't, and but I would look at a lifestyle like his and assume that his like hyper dialed in, like super optimized version of himself was like beyond inaccessible, right? It's just almost like this fiction for somebody like you or I. But then when he sat down and boiled down like his protocols and how he approaches things, it made me realize that this, not to big him up too much, but this like almost superhuman person who was so dialed in was no different than anybody else I know. He had just broken down his like values and principles into these smaller actionable goals and then follow them. And it was a nice place to begin as a first guest, because like if he can follow the process to get his health to the point where it is, like he was speaking at your event and he said that his resting heart rate is something like 46 beats per minute. Like that's nuts. But he didn't get there through being different to you or I. There might be like a small amount of genetics, I don't know, but he just got there by having a protocol, breaking it down to steps and then following it. And so I was kind of expecting that conversation to be him talking in these kind of broad terms about these difficult to grasp concepts, but at least from memory, and it was years ago now that I had the conversation, he was actually just like, no, you just do this and then you do this and you just do this for long enough and then it happens. And yeah, it was quite a formative idea for the first guest, because it's kind of a meta theme of everything I do, right?
The next question is from Chris, one of our partners at Horton's.
Hi Sean, love everything you do and congrats on 200 episodes. My question is in relation to the great point you make about those who inspire you are only 10 years ahead of you. Who right now would you most like to be in 10 years?
It depends what angle we take there, because I could almost, as I'm sure we all can, right? I could pull apart like every little facet of my life and be like, oh, that person is doing that thing really great. So like, I'm not sure if I care to be a enormous podcaster, but if I were to, which on some days I think that'd be nice, it has to be somebody like Chris Williamson, right? Not because he has the enormous reach, because to go back to what I said a while ago, I tweeted him when he had like essentially 0 listeners, right? And I'm
How
like,
many episodes is he on now, let alone listeners levels?
It's around maybe 850, give or take. So although he's not been doing it for a decade, like it's basically a decade's worth of weekly episodes were he to do it weekly, right? Somebody like that, not because he gets the Jordan Petersons and the Joe Rogans, not because he has massive forearms or a cool haircut, but because he has dialed in the ability to listen and be curious and works with speech coaches and listens back to episodes like their game tape and is like laser focused in his curiosity with so much intention in every conversation he has. A, that would be incredible to be like that on a podcast one day, but B, I imagine offline the conversations he has are so incredibly insightful and valuable. Because imagine having the ability to converse to such a deep level, right? Imagine the connection you'd have with your parents or your wife or your children one day if you could immediately get past the superficial, like, oh, it's sunny outside, and be like, what's your biggest fear? Or something like that. But like do it so naturally that it doesn't feel like this weird contrived thing. So there's people like that. There's people who have like, I don't know, I did an Instagram story the other day of my new style icon being George Heaton, which you'd never guess given that I'm wearing a multicolored flipping jumper right now. But like people like his like attitude towards his health is like really, really admirable. Like he has an app. There's like the Represent 247 app where you can just look at his workout plan every day and steal it. And I haven't yet stolen it. But like if you look at the time and attention and focus he puts into his body and his health, it's outrageous, but in the best way possible. Like he is so dialed in on taking his health so seriously. And he did this interview with Men's Health when he was on the cover a few months back, where he's like, I'm only 4 years into this. He's like, I've been bodybuilding for years, but I would like go and do biceps and back and like drink some protein. And he's like, but now I take it so intentionally and I'm so dialed in, and I've like paired running with bodybuilding and da-da-da. And it's like, imagine being so dialed in with your health that not only are you probably printing an additional 15 years onto the end of your life, another 30 years of longevity, that being defined as years that you can actually live and be mobile and play with your grandkids and da-da-da. But he looks wicked at the same time, right? And let's not pretend that that's not a thing that we're not all aiming for. Who else is 10 years ahead of me in their own respect? I'd love to be able to write like somebody like Johan Hari or Oliver Burkeman or Ryan Holiday, these people who take complex ideas or taboo topics or stories and anecdotes that you didn't think you needed to hear, you didn't think related to a certain topic, and bring it all together into this kind of wonderful story arc where you're like, I now suddenly understand this complex idea very well.
Do you think, I mean, what you've described, like with health, you can be very intentional with that. Writing to me seems a bit more abstract. It's a bit more talent based. It's like being an artist or something, isn't it? Do you think that just requires the same approach in terms of practice and putting the hours in, or is there other skills that you've got to develop to become that type of writer?
The honest answer is I don't know for sure, but the bet I'm making with myself in that area and every area that I'm actually focusing on, evidently, I'm not focusing on health all that much. I'd love to. I just always struggle to find the time, if I'm being honest. I'd love to one day.
You have run 3 marathons this year, though. You're not going to be completely off.
I'm not neglecting it, no, but there's not that level of intention. Maybe there will be this year.
Yeah.
I think the answer has to be as cliche as it is, time under tension, right? Because if you're, not literally you, but if somebody is making the argument that there is like a predetermined path for you in life and you're born with certain skills and you can't move beyond them, whether it's writing or public speaking or podcasting or whatever it is, that's very disempowering. Whereas, you know, you can read more books and write more drafts and spend 3 years on and off writing a book and then look back at the first chapter you ever wrote in 2022 and be like, that's terrible. But like the chapter I wrote, I had a funny story. One of the chapters was, past tense, based around Conor McGregor and his path to taking a difficult path. And then there was the court case, and I'm like, probably can't write a chapter about him, probably need to swap this out. So I had to rewrite it about somebody different. And it's kind of night and day, the level of writing between the two. I think that with any of these people that I point at, and I'm probably doing it in some ways subconsciously, right? Because I'm evidently a very different person to the person I was at episode 1 in the same way that you are, right? Like we first met 10 years ago. Your body transformation has been insane. Your business journey has been really amazing to watch. But like there's probably no single day where I woke up and thought, wow, Adam's a different person. You just kind of aimed for a North Star and like fumbled your way towards it. I'm sure you don't mind me saying that, right? There was never one day where you're like, I'm doing it. We fumbled towards it. So I look at all of these people and feel like they are a decade ahead, but maybe some of them are only 4 years ahead, right? Maybe there is a amazing body 4 years from now if I follow that path. Maybe there is this incredible curiosity that unlocks things like huge podcast guests if I follow that path. I think the bigger challenge is realizing that I can't have it all and deciding which of those decade-long paths to go down. And I'm sure any of them would be worthwhile. I just don't know which ones to do. And ask me in a decade.
Well, it's going to be an interesting journey to follow anyway. So the final question to finish off the podcast is from our good friend, Peter Watson.
Hello, Spooner. First of all, congratulations on the 200 episodes, brother. You're a better man than me. Got 2 questions. two questions that I think you'll have a compelling answer on. The first one is, what did you truly believe in your early days of business/life, that you truly believed that you no longer believe is the case, or your opinion has completely changed? I've got loads like myself that I've been thinking about, but love to hear your understanding on that one. And the second of all is, do you wish you bought Bitcoin when I told you to? Congrats on the episodes, bro. See you soon.
I knew that second question was coming. Let's address them backwards. Do I wish I bought Bitcoin? Yes, although I looked at the price I bought stacks literally last night. It's really weird that this came up when I first bought them before I sold out at a loss. And I think the price then was like double what it is now. So I'm kind of okay with my decision to not buy stacks because I would be even further in the red.
He asked about Bitcoin.
If I had bought Bitcoin when Peter first told me to buy Bitcoin, life would probably be quite different, right? Do I regret it? No, because you have to live with your decisions, right? There are many things I could have done, hypothetically, right? I could have gone to, when I was going to the gym in 2019 and looked a little bit wham, I could have kept going. Maybe I would have looked like George Heaton by then. When I had the big run of guests that we just spoke about in, I don't know, what was it, 2021, and it was growing and growing and growing, and I was like, oh my God, this thing might become a thing, and then I got lazy. I could have kept going, and it could have gone somewhere, but it didn't, right? And the same is true in reverse. There are stories where, like, I could have carried on drinking, which is a negative, but I chose not to, and therefore it's positive. You just have to live with your decisions. So I think I would stay up every night and cry if I really, really thought about it. But no, I don't regret it in the sense that we make decisions and we live with them, right? The first question, what did I used to believe to be true that I no longer do? The place my mind went here is a little bit woolly, but I think it will make sense, which is that growing up in a little council estate with my parents who were doing their absolute best and they gave us like everything they could. I have no complaints about them. They did an amazing job. I hope I improved that they did an okay job, right? But like, we were surrounded by small town people in a small town, and I say what I'm about to say with no disrespect, but my best friend from childhood still lives in the same house, on the same street, in the same estate, and they work in a, I'm going to be vague here just in case they happen to watch it, they work in a place which is like next door to their house that we had all gone to since children, right? And they don't seem to travel, and they don't seem to want to go and do stuff, right? And I get really torn on this, because on the one hand, I think I used to believe that life is inherently unfair, because coming from a place like that, I would look, even in my immediate surroundings, at like my friends' parents who had a car, and I'm like, oh, it's so unfair that they get to go and do things. Or then I went into secondary school and I'd look at my, there's one particular person in mind, but like my friends who had wealthier, or in some cases like wealthy families, and I'm like, oh, it's so unfair that they got like a Tag Heuer for Christmas and I got like an Advent. Do you know what I mean? Like, I would be like, oh, it's so unfair. It's so, like, I'm never going to get anywhere. And the reason I struggle with this idea and struggle to even know how to bring it into land in some ways is because on the one hand, I think I've learned that life isn't unfair, or at least it is fair to a degree, in so much as we've known each other for a decade. I've been trying to do this, like, doing stuff for 16 years now. That's depressing. I'm old, right? If you count back to the days when I started my first business, that was 16 years ago when me and Lewis sat down and were like, should we create a magazine? And at that point, I probably thought that life was very unfair because I didn't have the things that others had by default. And as such, I assumed that because I'm starting further back, I'm always going to be at a disadvantage and da-da-da-da. But I would like to think that lots of the kind of meta story that I've taught myself over that getting on for 2 decades of life is that you create your own luck, but also you harvest your own fairness. And what I mean by that is, I like to think, again, if I'm allowed to get away with saying this, that I'm a fairly high agency person. And this is where I struggle. This will make sense in a second why it's split down the middle. I'm a fairly high agency person, which means that I have allowed myself to progress in such a way where evidently life isn't that unfair, right? Because even compared to the person who sat down and recorded episode 1, where I was earning a lot less, I had no driving license, I was really unconfident, like there was just all of the things that I wanted to improve. My action has improved those things. Therefore, evidently, I was never at a complete disadvantage because if my actions could reverse it, that's not unfair as such. It's maybe just kind of cruel. Does that make sense? Like, it's cruel that some people start further back, but with agency, you can all move at a relative pace forward, even if I don't end at the same place as other people. But then the reason I struggle with that, and this is, I'm not even sure if this answers Peter's question, but it's taken us to an interesting place, is that I look at my friend from childhood, or indeed many of my friends from back then in like junior school, right? Despite my actions since then, I don't deserve a better life than them. Does that make sense? Not to go socialist on you, but in so much as, and Peter's going to love this, in so much as like, I didn't choose to be this way. This is the whole, like, is it environment or are you born with certain characteristics, right? I didn't choose to be trying to run a basketball team when I was like 9, right? And running raffles around the town to try and earn money to buy his kit. Like, I didn't choose to do that. That was kind of who I was. I didn't choose to serendipitously bump into somebody who 10 years later I'm still running a business with. I didn't choose to kind of skive off school to email Richard Branson's publicist and get an interview with him. And to give him the same chances, all of those people would do the same things.
Could you think back, though, to times where, I don't know, you read something, a teacher, a parent, a grandparent or whatever said something that just made it click that there were other routes to go down? Like, is there anything that comes to mind? Because I think there has to be some point of realization. You didn't choose it, but maybe there's got to be something that just knocked you off course. Say off course as in from that very generic school grades, career, like university route.
I think there are two things. One is more obvious than the other, and I'm really glad you asked that because I've always wanted to shout out this teacher but never had a chance to. The first is my dad would always just have this, like, and I'm sure most fathers do, but this like unwavering, absolute, unapologetic public certainty that I was going to go and do something interesting. Like, I don't know whether I'm not sure if he did the same to my brother when he was younger and like I wasn't around because my brother's 4 years older than me, but like he would always just be like, I can't remember exactly how he worded it, but like this is absolute unwavering certainty to the point where this sounds nuts and morbid, right? But I remember on my 16th birthday, I don't know where this came from, but he was like, no, actually two things. These are both a bit deep, but he was like, years and years before that, so probably when I was like 13, he sat me down one day. He was drunk. He just got back from the pub. So this was like beer talking, but he was like, if I go first, make sure you look after mum. He's like, make sure you do this and this and this and this. And then I came down the stairs like an hour later, bawling my eyes out, thinking he was like fucking dying or something. Because I'm like, why did you just say all this? He's like, no, sorry, I'm just a bit drunk. So there was that where he almost had this like certainty. But then on my 16th birthday, again, this sounds nuts in retrospect, but it was just this passing comment. I can't remember how we got onto it, but he said this thing. He's like, one day you're going to be like just about to go into the most important meeting of your life, or something like really significant is going on, and you might get a phone call saying I'm dead. And he's like, never let that news derail where you're going. Like, never let that stop you from going to perform at that talk or like do really well in that meeting. And to this day, I have no idea where that came from. But to this day, both of those ideas have stuck with me because they're almost like a roadmap by which I now live by, right? I try to take care of my mum, and there's this nice idea I heard recently it was probably on Modern Wisdom, of like, you should aim to be the person your mum thinks you are, which is a really nice idea, because like all of our mums think we're the most amazing, brightest, incredible, kindest, best intentioned person, right? And if you just try and use that as a heuristic, that's quite good. But number two, this like vision that he's like, you're going to go and do things, so don't let shit going on back home, which actually in a funny kind of cruel irony played out in things that we've spoken about, right? But he's like, just keep going. So there was like this foundation from my dad. And then when I was in year 10, I want to say, I was in this English class of all boys, and it was like just the knobheads of the school. Do you know what I mean? It was the people who would like shout out shit.
Were you
or
put into that
people.
class, or was that just by
No,
chance?
I was put into it. Yeah, it was like a selective group of 25 guys who were like in some way not engaging correctly with the curriculum, or needed like a different, it wasn't like an intervention, but it's the next best thing, right? Like, we were this guinea pig group, and we had this teacher called Mr. Wilson, Marcus Wilson, who to this day is my favorite teacher ever, because he was just wicked. I loved him. And he used to always do this thing where, I mean, imagine what it's like, right? You're like 15 and you're trying to do this business thing, and you're taking, I remember in his class once, I told him this was going to happen. I had to fucking hide under the table to take a phone call from the producers of The Apprentice to let me know whether or not I'd got into the next round. He didn't care. He was like, yeah, do your thing. But he used to always do this thing where he would either perhaps add more merit than was worth to the random kind of life lesson-y epiphanies I was having. Like, I remember he always used to, like, he paused once and he was like, say that again, what you just said. And I'm like, well, the reason I find time to go and do the business after school is like, there are 2 9-to-5s in a day, right? As in a literal sense, there are 2. So like, you don't need to stop all activity moving towards your goals when you're at 5 p.m. And he's like, wow, that's crazy. Like, it probably wasn't that crazy, but he was like leading into it. But then he would do this thing where he would like make a point in front of all of the other like annoying, loud, shouty, throwing chairs at each other kids that like Sean's doing something different and that's to be celebrated. Not Sean's doing something different, so like call him a prick and pick on him, which in fairness they didn't, but I think that's the reason he was doing it. There was probably something like protective within him, which is like, this guy's a bit fucking weird, but the path he's taking is probably valuable, particularly to a group of guys who don't seem to be getting on with mainstream education, who are going to need something in their favour in life. And it's cool that he encouraged that, because as much as I want to think that I was like wise and self-actualized when I was 16, I was probably the same fucking idiot that every 16-year-old is. And without that kind of elder male in a reassuring voice in front of all of my peers person in an environment which could so easily have discouraged me, being like, no, keep on doing what you're doing, who knows if I would. I really don't know.
So interesting that what's crazy is that teacher perhaps did or didn't realise the impact that those little comments or conversations had. But it just goes to show how impactful the role of a teacher can be, and how detrimental it could be for someone to go through that system. Imagine if you did the whole education system again, but that person wasn't there to just, to use what I said before, just knock you off course, and in a positive way, because there are plenty of people that have got that same level of agency, but then by all outside metrics and ways to determine if someone's successful could feel like a failure. Yeah. And that to me is mental, because I had a similar sort of experience. Like, I think I found myself in many of those rooms with the kids that didn't get on, without 1 or 2 teachers saying something that made me go, oh wait, actually maybe I'm not an idiot, that school could have turned out completely differently. So it's a big responsibility. And now I think, since having my own kids, it's made me really realise how important that is, because they could end up being really academic and great. Obviously they've got Chloe's genes, so that's a possibility. But if they turn out like me, then the school system isn't going to serve them. I think the more people to share those stories, the better, because hopefully someone's listening to this that maybe is going through that the school system and feels out of place, because they could, with the right person saying the right thing at the right time, completely change the course of their life.
It's the whole, it's definitely not my thought. What is it? Someone is once quoted saying something like, the A grade students go on to work for the C grade students. Yeah. But that's only if, to use your phrase, of being knocked off course, either through, online content or a teacher or a parent. Somebody just needs to be like, look, you don't fit in the system, but it's a necessity for the first 13 years of your life, or whatever it is, the first 18 years, but 13 years of schooling. Just get through it and take from it what you can, because you're going to be here anyway. The thing I always say, the time's going to pass. But you're right, maybe to go all meta and answer my own question that I couldn't answer a minute ago, maybe the idea is that life is inherently fair, but that we sometimes rely on this kind of spontaneous, serendipitous luck for the right person to come along and make a passing comment that means nothing to them, that actually transforms your view of yourself and the world.
What a note to leave it on. Sean, it's been a pleasure, and congrats on episode 200.